Hi, thanks for all of you tuning in or whatever you do to this live chat thing here. I'm with Julian Zelizer, who's the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And aside from being a friend and a terrific scholar, I can't think of anybody I'd rather talk to about some of the comparisons between today's racial situation, especially vis-a-vis the police, and the situation back in 1968. That's because Julian wrote a very compelling article in The Atlantic just a few days ago, Is America Repeating the Mistakes of 1968? Julian just edited a new edition of the Kerner report that we're going to talk about over the next couple of minutes. It's come out with Princeton University Press, and Julian has written the introduction to that. And Julian's most recent book is The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society with Penguin Press, out in paperback. So, Julian, welcome to our discussion.
Thanks for having me here.
I want to start by asking you about some of these comparisons that have been flying around between the recent racialized violence, the tragic shootings of two African-American males by police officers really just in the last couple of weeks, and of course the horrible incident in Dallas, the death of 5 police officers. A comparison between what's going on now between the police and African Americans and what was going on back in 1968. If you could set the scene for us back in 68, I'd appreciate it.
Well, 1968 is a very turbulent time in American politics. We had just gone through a civil rights revolution with the civil rights movement that had changed public opinion, that had changed the nature of debate in the 60s. And you had 2 big pieces of legislation, the 64 Civil Rights Act, which desegregated the South, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there had been these big legislative accomplishments. And then in 65, 66, Lyndon Johnson is the President of the United States. You have a Democratic Congress with huge liberal majorities. You start to see a change in the tenor of the debate as civil rights moves to the north, dealing with issues of northern urban America. There's more debates that start to emerge about issues like policing, like unemployment, like urban segregation. And in 1967, in November, as a turning point, you have 2 major riots. The first takes place in Newark, New Jersey. It starts with an African-American cab driver who the community sees as being harassed by the police. And then right after this devastating riot takes place over multiple days, there's another riot in Detroit. So these riots are unlike anything we've seen in recent years. They devastate both cities. They're the focus of the news. And Johnson, by the end of these riots, is feeling very despondent that his civil rights legislation is not being the civil rights activists don't appreciate what he had done, and there's a sense of chaos that the cities are literally coming unglued, and this is going into an election season, the presidential race for 1968.
Do you think that the political response, and now I have George Wallace in 1968 and Donald Trump in the current election, do you think there are parallels between the political response, between so-called populist or demagogue candidates, depending on your political preferences?
For sure. Look, you have, before them, you have the Black Power movement, which is a major force on the civil rights scene, is arguing that if you want to address the issues at the heart of this riot, you have to deal with issues like police violence against African Americans. You have the president who is sympathetic to a lot of those arguments and sets up the Kerner Commission to produce a big report on what's going on with these riots. But then you have the opposite, or a very different response. So one is George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who'd been a key opponent of desegregation, who's running for president in 1968. And he does a lot of what Donald Trump does. He plays to racial animosity. He tries to win over white voters who he says should leave the Democratic Party, working and middle-class voters, because of these kinds of racial issues. And he uses very incendiary language, and his rallies in 1968 would not be that different. They were worse often than what you see at Trump rallies. Physical violence outside, appeals to the KKK. And then, of course, you have Richard Nixon, who's the Republican running, and Nixon will also talk about what Wallace is talking about, but in a different way. And he uses the mantra of law and order and reestablishing law and order in the burning streets of America's cities.
Julian, tell us what Richard Nixon meant when he used law and order as truly one of his themes in 1968, and what Donald Trump means by it today.
Well, when Nixon was using it, I think he was clearly trying to appeal to Democrats. Again, white, middle, and working class Democratic voters who, at least since the New Deal, never thought they'd ever vote for a Republican.
Right.
Because the New Deal and the Great Society had brought them great benefits that their families depended on, that Americans depended on for their education and security. And I think Nixon was making an argument to them that these liberal programs weren't working, that the rioting that took place in 1967 was evidence, proof that liberal policies only made things worse. And finally, he wanted to say that look what happens when Democrats are in charge. Things literally come undone. And there is a part of Nixon that's appealing to a harder racist element in the country, and that by imposing law and order, he will reestablish the kind of racial normality that had existed in his mind before. So I think he's trying to build a broad coalition around this particular theme.
Now, you argue in your Atlantic piece that the staff of the Kerner Commission wanted really a much more critical report, and in fact, they were fired for advocating that. But still, the report was fairly critical of policing, and contained a famous phrase about the danger of America becoming two separate nations, one black, one white. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about how that happened and why it happened.
It's kind of amazing. So Johnson sets up this commission as a response to the riots. He's very cautious because Johnson, by the end of '67, is aware that the conservative turn had begun, certainly in Congress, and that he wasn't going to get much done. So he was very cautious. He didn't want a commission that was going to recommend things that were too bold, which would just embarrass him and put him in a hard spot at that point. So he stacks the commission with Democrats who he thinks will be loyal to him, including Otto Kerner, the former governor of Illinois, who was a Democratic loyalist. But the staff of the commission moves in a different direction, and there's all these social scientists, very left-wing, writing and doing investigation. They produced this draft report in November of '67, which is called The America of Racism. And the language is kind of stunning for a government product. It talks about the white power structure in the United States. It talks about institutional racism. It talks about institutional racism. It talks about rioters as political revolutionaries to some extent. And worst of all, it says that the Great Society programs were just token benefits for those who are living, which is an embarrassment.
Worst of all, for Lyndon Johnson.
For Lyndon Johnson, right. And so the head of the staff, David Ginsburg, who's also an old-time Democrat, instantly sees this is not going to fly. And so this draft is not going to work, and he literally fires all the social scientists who worked on this. He says it's for budgetary reasons. And they produce a new draft the following year. But the final draft is still pretty bold. Certainly if you read it from the perspective of today, it has the famous line that our nation is moving toward two societies. one black and one white, separate and unequal. It also keeps talking about this idea of institutional racism, that white racism, as this report says, the final report, is embedded in all of our institutions, and we'll never move toward an equal society unless we start to undo that. And it has very hard-hitting comments about issues like policing, where there's a lot of evidence in this lengthy report about how African Americans regularly encountered police harassment and brutality, and this was at the heart of almost every riot that had taken place in the middle of the 1960s.
You are an astute observer of the media. Could you say a few words about how the emerging social media, the availability of cell phones, has shined a light on a situation that I, for one, would argue has always been part of the American scene, certainly going back to Reconstruction, where you depend on police forces to, in essence, control the bodies of African American men.
Well, I'll start by saying I think you're right, and one of the fascinating parts of the report is they do these deep histories, and part of the argument the commissioners make is not only was each riot in 1967 instigated by a police encounter with an African American, but in these communities there was decades of history where the community experienced police in this way. So that's why one incident could be so explosive, because this was so familiar. And I think part of what's happened in the last few years is exactly what you say. There has been a visualization of what these encounters are like. There is a comparison that in the early 60s, part of what Martin Luther King and other activists did was to hold protests about desegregation in places he knew the media would come.
Right.
So the famous Birmingham March was captured certainly on in newspaper photographs and television. The Voting Rights March in Selma, people watched the brutality, and people like Richard Goodwin, who was a speechwriter for Johnson, he would recall in his memoirs that part of why voting rights gained such strength all of a sudden was people literally saw a kind of racial violence that they knew about and read about, but it was different to see it. And so I think that's part of what's happened in the last few years. The advent of a telephone, a smartphone, has become incredibly powerful combined with social media, which allows people to distribute these images quickly and in their entirety. And I do think having people see what these interactions are undercuts some of the defense that often emerges of why police are doing this. When this was closed, when it was off the public radar in terms of seeing it, I think it was different than what we have today.
But it's also our job as historians to point to some of the differences, and you and I have a particular interest in politics. And so let me tick off some of them between now and 1968 and get your reaction to this. Number one, we have a good number of African Americans in political office. We're comparing a situation where all African Americans are, in theory, allowed to vote and legally allowed to vote, although there is no doubt some voter suppression going on as of late. But compared to just a few years after the Voting Rights Act, African Americans have been voting for decades. We have African American police officers, even police chiefs, and we have a much more vibrant and vocal African American middle class, many of them in positions in the media to be able to fight back. So aren't we in many ways facing a very different situation than 1968?
We are. I think some of this came from when President Obama made this point and tried to, as he himself represents, demonstrate some of the differences and many areas of improvement that we've had. And I think it's hard to deny that. We do have a more culturally and socially integrated world in this country as well. which is undeniable. And so all those changes have happened, and I would argue that the Black Lives Matter movement has not yet reached the scale and scope of the civil rights movement that we had in the 60s, and nor are we engaged in the kind of war which created a turbulence in the 60s that we were in Vietnam. Even though the war on terrorism is huge, it's not that kind of war with a draft and thousands of people fighting overseas. That said, I don't know if the comparison really gets to the heart of the issue. The bigger issue is that the problems that emerged, certainly in 67 and 68, which we became more attentive of, still exist today. And there's a continuity between the periods because we never addressed them as a country. And so that, in my mind, is more relevant than the measure people are making is 68, 2016. There's differences, there's similarities, but one thing we know, the core issues that Black Lives Matter have been talking about have never, it's been decades, and we have not been able to address it. So that's, I think, where we need to focus. And one similarity that I do think is important, back to what we were discussing, is I do think there is this political impulse to move toward a law and order kind of solution that was strong then, and I think it's very strong right now. And Donald Trump instantly played on that by bringing back the phrase within days, law and order.
Right. Well, what you just said, you were saying this as I saw this post from one of our viewers. This is from Christy Coleman. And she said, funny you raise this question, and I'm assuming the question of history repeating itself, or this continuity you just talked about. She writes, my mother actually told me that she and her contemporaries have been lamenting this very thing. They're disheartened that their children and grandchildren are dealing with this. Your thoughts about that, Julian?
That's a poignant comment. When my Kerner Commission, when this report was, when I was about to put out this new edition about a month before, it was right before the New York Democratic primary, and so I gave a talk to a group of 7th graders at the Harlem Children's Zone.
They're the toughest crowd.
Yeah, they're incredibly bright students, and the entire class was African American students. And we were talking about Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders, and I started by asking, what the kids thought about the different candidates. And the first question someone said is, what we really want to know is who's going to keep us safe from the police. And it was an incredible question to get from a 7th grader, 12 or 13 years old, and all the students agreed and asked who's going to address this issue. So it is very disheartening to read something like the Kerner Commission report or earlier historical documents about these issues and realize that with all the improvements you mentioned, there are these major pockets of racial injustice that the country hasn't addressed. And in some ways, it's gotten worse. I mean, that's the other way. There's some aspects of race that have improved, but when it comes to criminal justice, there's a fair argument that with the changes in sentencing for drug crime, the expansion of the carceral state, as some people call it, the criminal industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, the issues Michelle Alexander has written about, the system's in worse shape than in 68. So that is disheartening, and I do think that's what the Black Lives Matter movement has really been about, beyond the specific cases that gave rise to them.
As a political historian and an influential pundit, what advice would you give to those in Black Lives Matter in terms of how to be effective going forward and how to win the kind of majority of public opinion that's going to be necessary to make some of these institutional changes that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I do think the movement's been pretty effective so far, especially given how grassroots it has been, and there's been limited funding for it, and the movement's really gained a lot of national attention for these important questions, and it's now spread out all over the country, and they have this decentralized model, which initially I was skeptical about, but I think in some ways it's worked. It's allowed local branches to take the issues in whatever way works locally. I do think,
and of course, it's easy for us to forget how decentralized the civil rights movement was. We think of Martin Luther King, right? And we think of national media, but in fact, those branches of SNCC, those branches of CORE, those branches of the NAACP, it was very decentralized.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And often King was what he did was he brought attention to fights that local activists were having for years, like voting rights, on their own. I do think, finding some really powerful leaders who could do what King did, who could keep the decentralized framework intact, but by their presence bring national attention to what the movement is doing, is very important. And I think very effective for civil rights in the 70s was to start winning campaigns locally, not just national presidential campaigns, but start to secure candidates either from the movement or sympathetic to the movement who win office locally in congressional races, because I think in the long run that's going to be very important to translating some of these issues into policy. And that's the final recommendation. I do think there's something powerful to having specific proposals on the table. And if there's one kind of area that might have been frustrating in the last few years, it's all the critiques are right on target, but it's often unclear for many Americans who are sympathetic, what's the solution, what's the fight for? And so you need something like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You need a bill that you can start to rally the country and rally members of Congress around. And I think that's going to be really important, especially something like policing, that for many people the solutions are not as obvious as how do you enfranchise Americans. And so I think that's going to be the third step of what needs to be done.
Many people would say, and some have written quite eloquently recently, that the real problem in police, civilian, especially African American men relations, is that the nation is awash in guns, and that police, but civilians as well, increasingly have a shoot first and ask questions later, because the person you're dealing with is likely to have a gun. To what extent do you think the hundreds of millions of guns that we have in this country are at the very heart of this problem, perhaps even more significant than the centuries-old racial problem when it comes to this issue?
I think it's very relevant. That's one of the first things the president talked about, and instantly people attacked him for politicizing the shootings. And I think his point was quite sound. And the basic issue is that there should be no need to separate effective law enforcement from a system that is racially just. And so one argument which I think is hard to refute is by flooding cities with guns, we have created an environment that does put police at risk and also creates high levels of uncertainty when a police confronts someone about what exactly the situation is they are going to enter into. And so there are solutions to that. By taking guns off the street, you would certainly change the atmosphere that exists and potentially create more space for better policing. And so I think that's extremely important and relevant to the situation. Again, it's not the only factor here, and racial attitudes are incredibly important, but certainly you can't remove gun control from the table and expect to have both safer streets for police and safer streets for citizens.
So you've written several books about Congress. You are an expert on Congress. Tell us why it is that, in spite of public opinion being fairly strongly in favor of more gun control, background checks, real concerns about the availability of assault weapons, nothing happens in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is an answer that revolves around the power of an interest group, and we often talk about the problems that campaign finance causes and the power of lobbyists and interest groups. And I think in this case, you really see it. The gun lobby since the 70s has been very effective in both parties at kind of gaining the attention and triggering the fear of key members, including leaders. And so I do think it's not conspiracy theory to argue that many legislators have no interest in triggering a campaign against them by the NRA. The second thing is the Republican Party shifted. It moved toward the South in the 70s through today. And I think in the House of Representatives, in a lot of districts that keep re-electing members, their support for guns is very strong. So even if nationally opinion is in a very different direction, in a lot of red districts that are pretty secure, legislators know they don't have much room to move on this issue, and they don't care. And as long as the House of Representatives is shaped this way, the Republicans have the majority, and these districts elect a lot of those Republicans, there's also an electoral incentive that will prevent the House from ever moving forward on legislation.
Julian, one of the ways that Richard Nixon channeled George Wallace on Law and Order was to choose Spiro Agnew, a tough-talking Law and Order county executive, as his vice president. Donald Trump is already a tough-talking Law and Order candidate. What does that say about the kind of vice president you think he'll choose?
Yeah, usually people pick a vice president who will be the attack dog.
How can you be more of an attack dog than Donald Trump?
It's hard to imagine, but obviously if it's someone like Newt Gingrich, you could imagine maybe the most vociferous attack team ever invented. So look, there's some speculation he'll pick someone calmer, more restrained. Boring, but that's not what he does.
Maybe even a loser.
Right, but I don't know. I think he loves the show. I think he loves the attack, and I think his instincts will be, let's double down on this kind of campaign, rather than, he doesn't like to balance anything out. That's not his instinct. So I do lean toward speculating it will be Gingrich or a Gingrich-like person, a Christie even, where they're just going to go full steam ahead in trying to bring down the Democrats.
Well, Julian, thank you for joining us. Julian E. Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society with Penguin Press. And he has written the introduction and has edited a new version of the Kerner report, very timely. That's the report we were talking about earlier, and that's out with Princeton University Press. Julian, it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me.